On August 5, 1964, North Vietnamese torpedo boats allegedly attacked U.S. ships in the Gulf of Tonkin. 2 days later, the Congress passed the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, granting the President greater authority to strike back against North Vietnam.
Hostile actions against United States ships on the high seas in the Gulf of Tonkin have today required me to order the military forces of the United States to take action in reply.
B-52s were sent to Andersen Air Force Base, Guam. KC-135 tankers were deployed to Okinawa. The B-52s were temporarily kept in reserve as a bombing operation called Rolling Thunder began in the north. The operation was flown primarily by Republic F-105 Thunder Chiefs, supersonic fighter bombers with a great load-carrying capability. Under America's self-imposed rules of engagement, there were some inhibiting refinements to the Rolling Thunder targets in the north. Traffic along roads, bridges, rail lines, and radar sites were eligible targets. But it was forbidden to hit surface-to-air missile sites or the MiGs visible on North Vietnamese airfields. North Vietnamese dikes damming the water for rice paddies were off limits. Consequently, the rice paddies became a favored site for North Vietnamese anti-aircraft batteries. Washington wanted the war to be contained without killing any Russian and Chinese advisors at the airfields and missile sites. MiGs were not to be attacked unless they showed hostile intent by turning in to make an attack of their own. Over the next 2 years, the USAF and the Navy accelerated their efforts under Rolling Thunder. They flew nearly 170,000 sorties. They dropped hundreds of thousands of tons of bombs. They killed almost 30,000 civilians. American bombing halted in 1968. The halt was supposed to be a signal to the communists that America was willing to negotiate.
By 1968, it was apparent that we were not there to win. We were not allowed to win. Rules of engagement, the tremendous restrictions. There were times when we were fired upon, we could not fire back, airspace, border requirements. And it was extremely discouraging, particularly when we were losing people every day. We were not allowed to do what we were trained to do, what we were capable to do, what the airplane was capable of doing.
North Vietnam used the halt to bring in Soviet equipment and Soviet advisors. They completely rejuvenated the air defense system. They built 40 surface-to-air missile sites around Hanoi alone. They brought into operation MiG-21 fighters equipped with Atoll missiles, which corresponded to the American Sidewinders. The North Vietnamese were sustaining the Viet Cong and their own regular units with supplies brought down a route known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. It was an intricate set of roads, rivers, and paths, shielded by a triple canopy of jungle. The trail had been used for centuries by guerrillas. The straight-line distance from Saigon to Hanoi was roughly 600 miles. But the trail was many times longer than that, twisting through Laos and Cambodia, sometimes crossing into South Vietnam. Interspersed with truck convoys were bicycles with sacks of rifles and humans carrying sacks of rice.
We forlornly tried to interdict the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which was absolutely impossible, up in northern Laos and so forth. And then, of course, we did some in-country work when someone thought they knew where some Viet Cong were, and you usually end up strafing trees.
When U.S. attacks temporarily took out bridges or roadways, human labor portaged the material to the next point, indefatigable as a trail of ants scurrying with their burdens.
We couldn't operate effectively at night, so the night was the time of sanctuary for the adversary. That's the time they reconstituted, repaired, regrouped, got ready for the next day.
Defense Secretary McNamara, believing in the power of technology, authorized $2.5 billion to be invested in a system called Igloo White. Igloo White consisted in part of airdrop sensors that detected troops or trucks by acoustic or seismic means. Information was relayed to an orbiting aircraft, usually an RC-121 Constellation. It was passed on to Task Force Alpha, where it was analyzed and an appropriate strike force called up. Igloo White had defects and limitations. Chief among them was the intelligent Vietnamese response. When they spotted an acoustic sensor parachuting down, they would locate it. Then they would run a single truck back and forth near it for hours, sending a signal that implied an army was going by. Ultimately, billions would be spent. Millions of dollars of enemy supplies were destroyed. But the net total arriving in the hands of the Viet Cong steadily increased. Just as in Korea, public interest in the war centered around the air-to-air combat with Russian and Chinese-built MiG fighters. But in Vietnam, there was no longer a 10-to-1 victory ratio. The ratio between 1965 and 1967 was about 3.5 to 1. From late 1967 to 1968, it fell to 2 to 1. The truth was that U.S. pre-war combat training had not been vigorous enough. There had been too much concern about flying safety and not enough about simulating the rigors of battle. As a result of tougher training after 1968, the USAF victory ratio climbed to 3 to 1, but it was still nowhere near the Korean War ratio. A number of factors led to the Air Force's low victory-to-loss ratio. One of the most important was that the North Vietnamese People's Air Force was strictly controlled from the ground. It refused combat under all but the most favorable circumstances. The McDonnell Douglas F-4 Phantom was undoubtedly the best fighter during the 1960s, and in many ways was suited to the Vietnam War. It had long range and could refuel in flight. It was fast and could carry a heavy load.
In an airplane like the Phantom, that had equipment in the back seat that was not in the front seat, that was designed to be operated by 2 people, it was a definite advantage to have 2 people under those conditions, highly trained, both highly trained, and to be able to fly as a team all the time. Chuck de Bellevue and I flew over 100 sorties together. Chuck was the best of any of the backseaters at UDARN, and I was very fortunate to be able to select him to fly with me.
What the early Phantom could not do was dogfight effectively with the MiGs. The MiGs were usually able to spot the larger F-4s first. Sometimes they would pop up from behind to fire a missile from the 6 o'clock position, then dive away. Dogfighting was also hampered because the first F-4s to reach Vietnam were armed only with missiles, originally intended for use against enemy bombers. Some pilots, like Ace Steve Ritchie, had success with missiles. But often, the F-4's missiles were no help.
The 7th Air Force rule was you had to close on him until you could visually identify him, and then by that time you were inside the range of the Sparrow missile. Most of the time you might even be inside the range of the infrared missile. And so what you're left with now is a gun situation, and there's no gun on the F-4.
As a quick fix, rapid-firing gun pods were mounted on the centerline attachment point.
That 20-millimeter gun and put a round about every 6 inches, and we come in there with two of those guns and just run the whole length of them, and just the boat, you could just see the boat. It would do like that, it would just fall apart, you know, just cut it right in 2.
Between 1968 and 1972, there was virtually no air-to-air combat. Instead of fighting MiGs, the F-4s were turned into bombers and escort fighters. The F-4 was often used in combination with the Republic F-105 Thunder Chief. A long series of accidents early in its life made the F-105 notorious. But in Vietnam, it became the supreme fighter bomber. It was the fastest aircraft in the theater. It was able to streak through the tough North Vietnamese defenses, drop its bombs, then, if necessary, dogfight its way out, using its internal gun to kill the MiGs.
We quickly found that we could, with conventional weapons and using some of the techniques that those of us who had had the opportunity to use in Korea were still familiar with and could teach and get other people to do. Using those techniques with conventional, dirty old 750-pound iron bombs, 6 of them hung underneath the belly, or 2,000-pounders on the wing, that we could do extremely precise bombing work with that airplane.
We're getting flak out the target one. Watch it.
When the bombing of Hanoi was authorized, the mission became known as going downtown. The Thuds led the way, both in bombing and in casualties.
Eagle flag, a lot of flak out south that middle side. Roger, let's go get it.
The Thud crews had only a 50% chance of surviving a 100-mission tour. A much larger, older, and more unlikely aircraft became a major player in Vietnam. The Boeing XB-52 made its first flight on April 14, 1952. It was intended as a high-altitude nuclear bomber, capable of single-plane missions to the heart of the Soviet Union. No one in the Air Force or at Boeing would have predicted that 20 years later, it would still be in use in Vietnam as an aerial artillery platform, flying in formation and dropping conventional iron bombs. At 30,000 feet, the B-52s were unseen and unheard from the ground. Their threat forced the enemy to break up its ground elements, spreading them out so that they would not be caught in a carpet of bombs. For the B-52 crews, life was a monotonous round of briefing, flying, and sleeping. There was a sense of remoteness to their actions that combined with tension, fatigue, and boredom to erode crew morale. Crew members mockingly called themselves coconut knockers for the hours they spent bombing the jungle. But the B-52s were reputedly the weapon most feared by the Viet Cong. By 1968, the United States was aware that it had to disengage from Vietnam. Secret negotiations between the U.S. and the North Vietnamese were intended to provide a framework in which the war would be Vietnamized. South Vietnamese forces would be so trained and strengthened that they would not require U.S. support. America could wash its hands of a war it had never wanted.